All right, my name's John Musser. Thanks for having me here again. It's always a pleasure to be in front of this group of the best strength coaches in the world. I'm going to speak to you briefly tonight.
Could you talk a little louder?
Yes, I can, sir. I'm going to speak to you briefly. We'll discuss briefly a concept called social capital. And the way that I became familiar with this was I also present at the Executive Protection Institute, and I do a lot of lesson plan work for them and a lot of program development. And a friend of mine named Dr. Elliot Jardines, he was the first Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence. And I was trying to bring him into the Executive Protection Institute as an instructor. And I was trying to find an area that he could bring to the table to assist these guys. And one of the issues that we always have is we'll have an instructor in front and he'll say, well, I reached out to a contact, or I called a friend in Paris, or I did this, and that's how I made this trip work. That's how I was able to get this done. And with a lot of people, they would say, well, what if we don't have those contacts? What if we don't have those people that we can call upon? Then we would do the same thing that a lot of doctors do, and they would prescribe exercise. And we would say, all right, what you do is you develop those contacts. And then we would give them no further direction on how to develop contacts. And when I explained this issue to Dr. Jardines, he said, well, how do you do business? And I explained a few things that I did, and he said, well, that's called social capital. And I said, well, it can't be called social capital because I've never heard of it before, so I can't have been doing it all these years. And he said, no, that's social capital. So we're going to do three things. We're going to define social capital, we're going to talk about why it's important, and how you get it and how you keep it. What do we mean by capital, right? Something of value, right? Cash, for me, it's generally information. It's a point of contact. It's a phone number. It's somebody to talk to. It could be a pickup truck. It could be money. It could be access to a location that you need. Capital is anything that you can use. It's an asset. And what do we mean by social? Well, obviously, social is just our interactions, the way we do business back and forth together. It's our interactions as people. A social network we'll talk about in a little bit. I have a graph up there that I'm very proud of. But a social network is who we associate with. It's who our world is and what that world consists of. And then the final thing that I want you to take away off of this slide is social capital is capital that belongs to somebody else within your network, but that you don't have control over. So you've got access to it because it's in your network, but you don't have control over it. It's Rip's pickup truck. I have access to it, but I can't make the decision whether to take it or not, right? It's a phone number that you have that I need, so I've got access to it because you're in my social network, but I don't have control over it. That's what social capital is. Does that make sense? All right, very good. All right, Nick. There we go. A social network consists of nodes and links or ties. The nodes are you and I, those little circles, those are the nodes. The links are our interactions. Now, depending on how you plot this out, you can represent those links in a variety of ways. But the more interactions you have, the closer you are connected. So if you came to the seminar, then that's one link that you have. If you became a starting strength coach, that's another link that you have. If you assisted someone at a meet, that's another link that you have. If you happen to marry one of your starting strength coaches, that's another link that you have, right? So it's tighter and tighter links. You can represent those. The more links that you have with someone, the more likely they are to assist you. Does that make sense to everybody? Very good. Structural holes are anything within a network that there is a gap. We can honestly see the gap there in that structural hole. So if this person here wants to reach that person back there, they've got all of those loops to go through. They've got to go through all those links. So if I need to reach Sully, and I have to start down here and go through all of you people to reach Sully, then it's going to be a much harder path, and it's least likely to happen, right? So what we look for is we look for opportunities to be boundary spanners. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, a closed network is good for protecting resources. A closed network is good for protecting resources, which could be information, it could be money, it could be a variety of things. But a closed network also is very hard, or it simply won't grow. And within a closed network, the only opportunities that you have are those within that network. Does that make sense? We have limited opportunities because we all know the same stuff, we all know the same people, we all know the same things. So a closed network is something that we want to avoid. The boundary spanner part is when you reach out to another network and you are that link between those two networks. So when Matt reaches out to our speaker that we had last night, that was linking two networks together. So now we have access to those resources. I was putting together an advisory committee for a decision maker, and I went to a friend of mine and I said, would you be on this advisory committee? And he said, yes, I absolutely will, but do me a favor and reach out to people who know people that we don't know. Does that make sense to everybody? We want to bring people in. I want to bring people in that know people that I don't know and that have access to resources that I don't have. It's a very simple concept, but it's often ignored. We want to reach out to those organizations and to those groups of people that we don't normally have access to. Our boundary spanners are Sully, they're Matt, there are a couple others. Nick in the back, he reached out to the science department at his university to sponsor or to sign off on his strength program. The science department, you wouldn't think that the science department would be associated with the strength program. Those are the boundary spanners. So always look for opportunities to shorten that distance and be that boundary spanner. Social capital, to make use of it, requires two things. It requires access and mobilization. I can have access to a resource. I know Rip, I know he's got a pickup truck, and I know it's right there. I've got access to it. But when I call him up and he says, fuck no, you're not taking my pickup truck, then I simply couldn't mobilize it, right? I couldn't mobilize it. So I have to develop the relationship with Rip so that when I reach out to him, I can mobilize that asset. Does that make sense to everybody? I can't just cold call somebody, or if I do cold call somebody, I better be very good at it to get that favor. Access and mobilization. What does social capital look like? Well, the first thing is trust. The person has to trust you and trust that you're not going to do anything with his assets or with his contacts, with his capital, that he doesn't want you to do. I went to work for a protection detail about 25 years ago, and the head of the detail brought us all in, and they were paying us a ridiculous amount of money. And the guy said, all right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull all of our contact data. So your contact list that you have for all the places that you've traveled and your contact list, I'm going to put them all together. And I think that's a great idea. And I said, well, I've got a great idea. Why don't you go fuck yourself? You know? How I'm going to give some knucklehead all the people that I know, all the phone numbers I know, all the names of the people in important places. I'm just going to give that to him in a list. My tenure there was not long-lived, but I wouldn't want to stay there anyway, right? Because somebody that feels that way, if I pass your data out without your permission, then I haven't earned your trust to do that, have I? I've reached out to people within this room and said, hey, can I give this person your phone number? And they said, John, the phone number's on the fucking website. It's not a big deal. I'm like, well, still wanted to have permission. It requires opinion leadership. You have to be the person that is the go-to for something. As subject matter experts, it's very easy for us to get locked into our own world where we don't feel that we need something else. We don't feel that we need to know this person. We don't feel that we need to have a good relationship with this person because we are so good and so talented that we don't need those assets. Maybe. And there's a lot of subject matter experts that go their whole careers and their whole lives, and they're perfectly fine that way. If you want to grow, I would recommend that you become known as the opinion leader in a thing. So people come to you for stuff. A sense of obligation. The sense of obligation. Nick and I was at the second Starting Strength Coaches Association meeting. He and I developed a friendship. I've been back and forth to a couple of his strength meets. I've judged at his strength meets. I've been to a couple speaking engagements there. Sully and Andy put the book together, and I feel a sense of obligation for Nick opening his doors to me and accepting me in. I feel a sense of obligation for Sully and Andy for putting this book together. So when somebody reached out to me and said, listen, will you help us with this book tour? I had a sense of obligation to help them with that book tour, didn't I? I had that sense of obligation. So is the person that you're asking for help, do they have a sense of obligation to you? So the takeaway from this slide is access and mobilization. Having access is not enough, but being able to make that stuff mobilize. And the trust, opinion leadership, and sense of obligation. Now, maintenance is required. Social capital is one of those things that increases the more you use it. The more favors I do for you, the more favors you're going to do for me, and that social capital will increase, and those ties will increase. So far, so good? Very good. Now, this is the last slide, but it's the two most important questions, right? After we've defined the terms, how do we get social capital, and how do we get it? Or how do we keep it? Well, social capital, it can be a very small event. It's simply put, being aware of the opportunity to do the right thing. Not because you think you're going to gain something from it, but simply because it's the right thing to do. So if there's 3 or 4 of us standing around and we're all talking and we're all huddled up, and someone comes up and they're kind of hanging back to the edge, then it's the very subtle step back a little bit and open up the door for them and let them come in and be a part of the conversation. It's very subtle things like that. When you're at the second Starting Strength Convention and you're involved in a very contentious discussion on the direction of the organization, and the person in front of you turns around and looks at you and smiles and lets you know you're on the right track, that's a certain degree of getting that social capital. Very small thing. 25 years ago, I was working for a client that was sort of a politician, statesman, kind of goofball, and he wrote a bunch of books, and I was taking him on to lecture in front of a large facility. And the guy working the gate, the officer working the gate, which if you've ever stood post on the outermost perimeter of a facility working a gate, you know it's a shit job. When I came through ahead of time to take a look at the place and check it all out and make sure I was comfortable with it, the officer on the gate said, I'm a big fan, and he mentioned the client's name, and we're studying, and he named off one of his books in a class that I'm at in college. I'm working on my bachelor's degree. Great. The next day, When we pulled up to that gate, it's a very safe environment, I said, "Sir, this is Officer such and such. He's been a big help, and he's studying your work in college." It's a gate guard. Pretty far down on the totem pole, right? How much did that cost me? Cost me nothing, right? Cost me nothing. Went on about my business, never thought anything more about it. It was just a regular day. 10 years later, I'm in a state that is known for being a pain in the ass to issue particular licenses that I need. And I walk in this facility, I sit down in this chair, there's people with guns and badges all around, and somebody comes out and says, "Are you John Musser?" Your first impulse is to run. But I didn't do that. I sat there, and they took me back in front of the guy at the desk with all the stuff on that granted the gun permits. And he said, "It's good to see you again." I said, "Yes." He said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "I was working a gate when you brought such and such through. It's been a long time ago, and that always meant a lot to me. And by the way, here's your permits and shit. I recognized your name." Now, did I think that 10 years ago when I did that guy was going to rise to some position of authority and power? But that little bit of social capital, that little seed planted, paid off way down the road. So if you get in the habit of always doing the right thing and looking out for people, and to properly look out for a customer or for my friends or the people in my network, I've got to know them, so I've got to listen more than I talk. And I look for opportunities for them. I look for people, for ways to help somebody, and I just look for opportunities. Hey, you know what would be a good guy for you to meet? It would be this guy. You know who could help you? Maybe it'd be great to call them. I'll call them and let them know that you're going to call. That's how we get social capital, by simply doing the right thing all the time and knowing the people within our network. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, now here comes the tough part. How do we keep it? It's pretty easy too. The first thing is you thank people. You thank them profusely, right? You thank them in person. You thank them in little note cards. You thank them with an email. If I send a quick email, I almost always follow it up with a thank you card. It's a small thing. People don't get stuff in the mail anymore, but it's a very small thing to do. It's a quick thing to do, and it means a lot to people. Especially, it means more now, I think, than it used to, because getting something in the mail now is sort of unusual. A pleasant something in the mail, not a subpoena or something. That's a way of keeping it. I look for ways to repay them. If somebody sends me work that involves money, then I make sure that I look very hard to find something to send to them that can put some money in their pocket. They can put some money in their pocket. Now, occasionally, someone will help you that they are simply at a level that they're beyond your ability to help. That they're in a position of authority that you can't help them, that they have reached where they needed to be. So the way that I found to do that is I recognize them, and I recognize the help that they've given us as often as I can. Gotcha. So I recognize the help that they've given, and I try to recognize it in a venue where it will get the most press as possible. Now, going back to the trust issue, do I recognize the help that they give me without first checking with them if it's all right if I mention to somebody that they helped me? You think that's a good idea? I generally don't. If somebody helps me in a big way, I say, man, this is a very big deal. I really appreciate this help. Is this something I can share? And they're like, what are you fucking talking about, John? Yeah, that's fine. Help yourself, you know. So you recognize the help that they give you. It's this, if you've ever looked at like a book that said something like How to Win Friends and Influence People, this is the exact opposite of that. That's about scamming people. That's about playing people. Well, if they've got a half a brain at all, they know that they're being played, right? So we don't play people. We just look for opportunities to help people. So what we're going to do is that we are going to be a boundary spanner. We're going to look for opportunities to reach out to people in a network other than the one that already exists. The second thing we're going to do is we are going to be the very face of social capital. We're going to make sure that we have their trust. We're going to make sure that we are opinion leaders. So far, so good. And we understand that these things require maintenance. What's the other one? Sense of obligation. Trust, opinion leadership, and a sense of obligation. And the maintenance is required. We get social capital by simply doing the right thing as often as we can, whenever we can, and we keep social capital by recognizing it and thanking people to do what they do. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, very good. So has anybody heard the term social capital before? Yeah, good. It's interesting. It's an interesting way to put things into a model that makes sense. It's probably a lot of what many of you are already doing, but this puts it in a model that maybe you can apply it a little cleaner, a little bit better.